A driver in 1978 could crest the Cumberland grade in neutral, push 100 watts through his CB, and swing wide around the chicken coop on a farm road he'd memorized 10 years earlier. Nothing happened to him. Do any one of those tonight and a single citation can run past $9,800, plus a mark on a safety record that follows you to every carrier you ever apply to again. So why are the men with the most to lose, the 30 and 40-year drivers, still doing some of these? Right now, tonight, on a highway not far from you. Here are 12, what they cost, and the honest reason nobody quit. Walk into a truck stop in Effingham, Illinois in 1978 and ask a driver at the counter whether any of this was cheating, and he'd have looked at you the way you'd look at a man who asked whether breathing was cheating. The job was a math problem that didn't solve. Dispatch promised a delivery time. The dock foreman was running 3 hours behind. The logbook allowed 10 hours. The load paid by the mile, and the note on the truck didn't care about any of it. Every trick on this list was invented to close that gap. Most of them were invented by men who were proud of their driving, not ashamed of it. One by one, Washington shut them down. Some for good reasons, a few for reasons that still make old hands grind their teeth at a counter in Amarillo. But the interesting part isn't which ones died, it's which ones didn't, and number one is the trick that built the outlaw legend in the first place. It's also the only entry on this list where there's no clever way around it left. Number 12. The Georgia overdrive. Every old hand knows this one. You top a long grade in the Appalachians, pull the stick out of gear, and let 80,000 pounds ride gravity down the mountain while the needle on the fuel gauge sits dead still. Georgia overdrive, midnight gear, Mexican overdrive. The name changed with the territory. The problem with it was never complicated. A loaded rig rolling in neutral has zero engine braking, nothing holding it back but service brakes, and once those cook on a 6% grade, the truck stops being a truck. Those sand ramps carved into the shoulder above Monteagle and on Interstate 70 dropping into Denver were not landscaping. Somebody built each one because somebody needed it. Coasting in neutral is now illegal for commercial vehicles in nearly every state. A driver caught doing it on a downgrade gets cited, gets it on his safety record, and in a bad case gets put out of service where he sits. And yet the veterans are still chasing those same free miles because the modern version is legal and it actually works better. Run the truck up to the top of the governor before the crest, ease off, and ride momentum down in gear with the drive line still connected. Same fuel savings, full control the whole way. The old hands never stopped coasting. They stopped disconnecting. That one was about the fuel. The next one was about the clock, and the clock was always the bigger lie. Number 11. The comic book. Before anything was electronic, drivers ran on paper, and paper will hold still for whatever you write on it. The move was to keep two books. One was clean, legal, unremarkable, and lived on the dash for the scale house. The other one, if a man kept one at all, tracked what actually happened. The official book had a nickname. Drivers called it the comic book because that was about the ratio of truth in it. A man could show 10 hours and run 20, sketching in 8 graceful hours of sleeper berth that never happened while the real miles stacked up between Chicago and Laredo. Some of the sharper ones filled theirs in days ahead of time, working out in front of the deadline like a man writing fiction on a schedule. Logbooks sat by the register at every truck stop in America, and nobody behind that register was confused about why a driver might need a spare. Federal enforcement figured this out a long time ago. Falsifying a record of duty status is now one of the most heavily penalized violations in the industry, with fines running into the thousands per offense, and a pattern of it puts a driver's license and a carrier's operating authority in the same crosshairs at the same time. December of 2017 ended the paper era for good. What it did not end was the math problem, and here's the thing the compliance people never understood. Ending the comic book didn't add an hour to anybody's day, it just moved the whole argument onto a screen. Number 10. Working the electronic log. When the mandate landed, the paper tricks were supposed to be finished. The game just changed venue. The crude version showed up almost immediately. Driving time logged under a co-driver who didn't exist. A device that came unplugged and stayed that way. Miles running under an unassigned profile that nobody ever claimed. The feds treat every bit of that exactly the way they treated the comic book, except now the penalties have teeth and the truck testifies against you. Falsification can cost thousands per incident. Park a driver for 10 hours minimum and pull the entire carrier into a compliance review. The engine control module logs the miles whether the device is plugged in or not. But the crude versions aren't the interesting part. The rules also allow a driver to move off duty for personal reasons and to make short moves inside a yard without burning drive time. Both are legitimate. Both exist because a man who runs out of hours at a closed dock still needs somewhere safe to sleep. What auditors watch for is stretch. A personal conveyance leg that happens to cover 80 miles in exactly the direction the freight was headed. A yard move that leaves the property. And they don't read these one at a time anymore. They run pattern analysis across a whole fleet, and the outliers float up on their own. So here's the part that surprises people. This is the one entry on the list where the veteran runs circles around the rookie, because used correctly it's completely legal, and most drivers under 40 are too nervous to touch it at all. The 40-year man knows exactly where the line is. That's not defiance. That's just knowing your own rule book better than the safety department does. The log was one way to buy time. The radio was how you bought information, and that had its own black market. Number 9. Boots on the CB. The FCC caps a citizen's band radio at 4 watts of carrier output. 4 watts was never going to satisfy men who wanted to hold a conversation from Amarillo to Oklahoma City, so an underground trade in linear amplifiers grew up through the late 70s. Boots, foot warmers. Everybody had a guy. A decent boot pushed a signal into the hundreds of watts and walked straight over every other conversation for 50 miles in all directions, which was the entire appeal and also the entire problem. The FCC banned them and did not treat enforcement as a formality. Getting caught with one wired into the radio brought forfeitures climbing past $10,000, and the equipment went in the trunk of somebody's car and never came back. Ask any old hand and he'll tell you half the personality of Channel 19 died when the boots got cracked down on. He's probably right, though the FCC would point out that the other half died because 40 men shouting through amplifiers isn't a conversation either. What replaced the boot wasn't legal wattage. It was a phone and a group text, and something real got traded away in that swap. Most of the veterans still keep a radio in the cab anyway, even with the channel nearly silent. Not because it's useful, because switching it off would feel like conceding something. The radio told you where the bears were sitting, but there was a faster way to find that out, and it lived on the dash. Number 8. The fuzzbuster. Four-wheelers can still run a radar detector in most of the country. Commercial drivers lost that in 1994 when the federal government banned them in all commercial vehicles nationwide. Before that, a detector on the dash was standard equipment, right next to the thermos, and it genuinely worked. A driver up against a tight delivery window could pull real hours out of a coast-to-coast run just by knowing which side of the median to watch. Then the research came out tying detector use to speed-related crashes in heavy trucks, and Washington closed the door on the entire industry in one motion. Today, an inspector who spots a detector during a roadside writes it, even if it's unplugged and buried under the paperwork in the glove box. The driver takes the violation, the carrier takes the score hit, and it stacks on top of whatever speed he was actually running. A little black box that used to save careers now ends them, which is a strange thing to think about while 4 million people drive down the interstate with a navigation app open, tapping a button to report a police car to every stranger behind them. Same information. Same purpose. Completely legal. The veterans use it constantly, and a fair number of them find the whole situation funny. Now, an app can tell you where a cruiser is parked. It was never any good at the other problem. Number 7. Dodging the chicken coops. The scale house has been the driver's natural enemy since the first one opened. When a man was heavy, out of hours, or carrying paperwork he'd rather nobody studied, Channel 19 lit up with directions to the back way around, and any driver coming the other direction would tell you whether the coop was open or closed before you were close enough to see it. Every scale in America had a bypass. Some farm road that cost you 20 minutes and skipped the entire conversation. The veterans had them memorized from Barstow to Baltimore without ever unfolding a map, and there was a whole etiquette around it. You passed the word without being asked. You returned the favor when somebody passed it to you. And the scale masters knew perfectly well what was happening on the roads they couldn't see from the window. States answered with portable scales, chase units parked on those exact back roads, and signage that made it a citable offense for a commercial vehicle to roll past an open scale. Get caught on the Dodge route today and you take the evasion fine plus whatever you were carrying that made you dodge in the first place, and inspectors treat a scale runner as a man worth taking the whole truck apart over. So the bypass mostly leads to a portable scale now. But watch what the old hands actually do, because it isn't what you'd expect. The veteran runs the scale on purpose. Every time, legal, papers straight, nothing to discuss. He isn't avoiding the coop. He's building a record so clean that when the roadside eventually happens, and it always eventually happens, the inspector spends 11 minutes on the truck instead of 2 hours. The Dodge got replaced by something better. Boredom. Number 6. Idling all night for heat. For 50 years, this was simply the job. A driver shut down outside Cheyenne in January, left the diesel turning over, and slept warm while the engine drank a gallon an hour. Nobody gave it a thought. That low rumble of 100 idling trucks was the sound of a truck stop after midnight, as much a part of the place as the griddle going at 5 in the morning. Then the anti-idling laws showed up. More than half the states restrict commercial idling today, most of them to 5 minutes or less, and hundreds of individual cities pile their own rules on top. California enforces it hard. New Jersey penalties reach 5 figures on repeat offenders. In New York City, any citizen with a phone can report an idling truck and collect a cut of the fine for the trouble, which leaves the driver squeezed from both directions. Shut it down and sleep at 10 below, or leave it running and pay. Auxiliary power units solve it for the fleets, but a unit runs upwards of $10,000 installed, and that is a brutal number for a man counting every dime against a fuel receipt. So, do the veterans still idle? Some of them, yes, and they'll tell you exactly why without any apology in their voice. They idle where the rule isn't enforced. They idle when the alternative is genuine risk, and when a ticket comes, they treat it as the cost of not freezing. Others solved it the way old hands solve most things, with a bunk heater, a good bag, and the kind of layering a man learns once and never forgets. Nobody in that generation ever considered cold a reason to stop working. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe. This channel covers the trucking that existed before the computers did, every week. All right, here's where the money stops being theoretical. Number 5, red dye diesel. This is the granddaddy of expensive mistakes. Off-road diesel gets dyed red because it's sold without highway fuel taxes, intended for farm tractors, generators, and reefer units. The old move needed no explaining. Fill the tractor tanks off the farm tank or the reefer pump, keep the difference. The IRS calls that tax evasion, and the penalty schedule was written by somebody with no sense of humor whatsoever. Dyed fuel in your running tanks brings $10 per gallon or $1,000, whichever comes out higher, and that is per violation, per tank. On a truck carrying 300 gallons, run the arithmetic yourself and see how fast you get toward that $9,800 number in the title. Inspectors at the scales carry dip tubes and pull samples on no schedule at all, and the dye hangs around in trace amounts long after the tanks have been run dry and refilled with clean fuel. So why does this one refuse to dye? Because every farmer in America has a red tank sitting 50 feet from a truck that burns the identical fuel, and the temptation is measured in feet. This is the entry where the honest answer is uncomfortable. It still happens. It happens mostly in agriculture, and the men doing it are not thinking of themselves as tax evaders. They're thinking of it as their own fuel, in their own tank, going into their own truck. The government disagrees. In writing, at $10 a gallon. Number 4, the emissions delete. When diesel particulate filters and exhaust gas recirculation arrived on new trucks, they choked power, plugged up constantly, and left drivers sitting on the shoulder waiting out a regeneration cycle with a load going cold behind them. A whole industry of delete shops appeared almost overnight. Gut the filter, straight pipe the exhaust, reflash the computer to match. The truck pulled better and cost less to keep running. It was also a straight federal violation under the Clean Air Act. The EPA has hit delete shops with multi-million-dollar settlements, and an owner-operator caught with a deleted truck can face penalties reaching tens of thousands of dollars per vehicle on top of buying and installing every component back. California can pull the truck off the road and keep it there. Nothing else on this list turns a working man's truck into a lawn ornament faster. And the frustrating part is the men who did it weren't outlaws. They were mechanics trying to keep a $200,000 asset moving, which is why the veterans didn't stop caring about emissions equipment. They got obsessive about it instead. Ask an old hand about his DPF and you'll get 20 minutes on regen intervals, oil specification, and the exact highway speed that keeps a filter clean enough to never need forcing. Same instinct, same refusal to let the truck beat him, legal now and cheaper. Number 3, straight pipes and the Jake in a posted zone. There is no sound anywhere on earth like a Detroit coming off a mountain with the engine brake open. To a driver, that's music. To a town at 2 in the morning, it's an act of aggression. Hundreds of municipalities put up those famous signs, and plenty of drivers read them as a strong suggestion, especially the outlaws running straight pipes with nothing in the exhaust at all. Those ordinances carry real money now, often several $100s a stop, and a truck without proper muffler equipment can fail a roadside inspection outright. In noise-sensitive corridors through Colorado and New York, repeat offenders have stacked penalties into the thousands, and if you've ever wondered why a safety device gets banned at all, so has every driver who's read one of those signs while loaded and pointed downhill. The engine brake was never the crime. The open pipe was. Put a proper muffler back on, and a Jake is quiet enough that most of those towns would never have printed the sign, which is exactly what the veterans figured out. The old hands run the Jake constantly, and they run it through good exhaust, and nobody in any town has ever called anybody about it. The trick was never the noise. The trick was learning where the pipe ends and the brake begins. Number 2. Turning up the governor. Most fleet trucks are limited electronically, commonly at 65 or 68 miles an hour. To a man paid by the mile, that limiter is money leaking out of the stacks every hour of every day, and reprogramming the engine computer to unlock the top end became a quiet specialty at certain shops that never advertised anything. The trouble was never really enforcement. It was the trail. That control module records everything, and the first thing investigators do after a serious accident is pull it. A truck governed on paper at 65 that shows 78 in the crash data becomes a plaintiff's attorney's entire case, with liability exposure running into the millions. On the enforcement side, tampering voids warranties, invites federal attention, and costs a driver his job the day the telematics report reaches a safety manager's desk. That extra 10 miles an hour was never free. It just got billed later to somebody who wasn't in the truck. So the veterans quit chasing speed and started chasing the clock instead, which is where the money always was anyway. Leave 2 hours earlier. Fuel where the lot is easy in and easy out. Take the route with 4 fewer traffic lights instead of the one that's 11 miles shorter. A 40-year driver and a rookie can run the same lane at the same governed speed, and the veteran gets there 40 minutes ahead. Not because he drove faster, because he stopped less. And that brings us to number 1. The trick that made outlaw trucking a legend in the first place, running heavy on the back roads after dark. In the golden era, when a load paid by the ton and bridge laws were enforced by a handful of scattered scales that kept bankers' hours, drivers hauled grain, steel, and logs at weights that would put a modern inspector on the ground. The play never needed explaining to anybody. Load past legal, wait for dark, run the county roads where no scale ever opened. Grain haulers in Kansas, log trucks in Oregon, coal buckets in West Virginia. Whole regional economies ran quietly on it, and the local sheriff generally had a better use for a Tuesday night than weighing a neighbor's truck. This was the world that Smokey and the Bandit turned into a box office legend in 1977, and the picture barely exaggerated. Men wore the outlaw label with real pride because the load paid the mortgage, and the downside was a conversation with a judge who'd known your father for 30 years. Today, that same run is a minefield. Overweight schedules in many states climb by the pound, so a rig 15 or 20,000 over gross can generate a single citation that lands right around that $9,800 figure and keeps going from there. New York and Pennsylvania have written overweight tickets worth more than the truck they were handed to. Add portable scales, bridge sensors, and plate readers mounted on the bypass roads themselves, and the midnight heavy run is finished. And before somebody says it in the comments, yes, there are permits. A man can haul heavy legally today with a routing survey, an escort, and a folder of paperwork thicker than the load manifest. That's a real answer, and it is not the same thing. Permitted heavy haul is a specialty trade with its own equipment and its own margins. It isn't a farm truck running 2,000 extra bushels down a county road at midnight because the elevator closed at 6. This is the one entry with no shadow version. Nothing survived. No clever legal equivalent, no modern workaround, no veteran quietly doing the same thing inside the lines. It exists in stories now, which is probably where it belonged the entire time. Look at the 12 together, and a pattern shows up that has nothing to do with rule breaking. Every one of them existed because the job squeezed drivers between impossible schedules, thin pay, and a thermometer that didn't care about either. The regulations won, and the highways are safer for most of it. And any old hand who watched a runaway come down a grade will tell you the same thing. But notice how few of these actually disappeared. The coast turned into momentum driving. The fuzzbuster turned into an app. The comic book turned into a status button that a veteran uses better than a rookie ever will. The scale dodge turned into a truck so clean the inspection takes 11 minutes. The men who ran those years didn't stop being resourceful. They got better at it inside the lines, which is the part the compliance seminars never seem to grasp about a 40-year driver. Walk into a truck stop today, and the coffee is worse, the conversation is thinner, and the man on the next stool is looking at his phone. But he's working the same problem they were working in 1978 with a tighter clock and a smaller margin. If you drove in that era, tell us in the comments which of these you saw with your own eyes and which ones we missed, because there are easily 15 more where these came from. And hit subscribe, because next week we're covering the truck stops of the 1970s that no longer exist. The full-service diners, the drivers-only lounges, and the showers that cost a quarter. Keep the shiny side up.